Okay, so we are back today to do a lecture on environmental ethics. This is a very interesting lecture, and we will talk quite a bit about environmental ethics this semester. So I want to take some time with this, where our objectives for this lecture are going to be to describe the views of influential environmental ethicists. So we'll talk about a few different major environmental ethicists that have influenced our views on that topic today. And then we're going to define the three major approaches to environmental ethics. We're going to give examples of the 4 levels of ethical responsibility. We're going to define greenwashing, talk about what it is, and then provide some examples. We'll also describe the environmental justice movement and how that's different from just the environmental movement. And then we're also going to explain the utilitarian view of animal welfare and explore some questions associated with that. So let's first talk about what environmental ethics is. Ethics, just ethics alone, is a branch of philosophy that seeks to define right versus wrong. And of course, the big question with any ethics movement is who's to judge the right from wrong? So that is always one of the big questions at the forefront of ethics. When we talk about environmental ethics addresses the ethical relationship between humans and the environment. And so we're going to talk about that relationship between humans and the environment, and again, what is ethically right and what is ethically wrong. Now, as we talk about a lot of these environmental ethics questions, again, it's very hard to determine a right versus wrong answer because, again, this all comes back to who is the judge, right? So I also want you to do an assignment, and I actually want you to do this assignment before you complete this lecture. And the assignment's called Thinking About Our Responsibilities. It's a series of questions. Again, they're ethical questions, environmental ethical questions. And so there is no right from wrong answer. I want you to do those questions at the beginning of the semester. And I'd like you to submit those to me. You'll see the due date in Canvas. And then we're going to do it at the end of the semester to see if your answers have changed at all. So it'd be kind of interesting. All right, so let's talk about kind of how ethics and environmental ethics kind of started. So we can talk about Native American ethics kind of to start things off. And obviously there are many native religions that see humans as kind of a part of nature. Now, this is obviously going to vary from tribe to tribe. They have many different views, but for the most part, many of them have this kind of common theme. And that common theme is that Earth is a mother, and that it provides, right, for all of these other species, all of these species on the planet Earth, and that these species are all our siblings, okay? And so that we should all respect the earth just as we would respect our mother. And so again, this was kind of a common theme for many Native Americans. This was very different than when Europeans began to colonize North America in the early 1600s. And Native American tribes had been living sustainably for thousands of years. But many of those colonists, the European colonists that moved in, viewed North America as kind of a land with its inexhaustible resources and a wilderness that was more to be conquered and managed for our human use. So to kind of sum up Native American ethics and how that was, again, different from many of the ethics that came from European colonists in the 1700s. Chief Seattle, who was a kind of influential chief that was in the Pacific Northwest during the late 1700s, early 1800s. And he had a famous quote that said, "Man does not weave this web of life. He is merely a strand of it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself. So that was a good quote to kind of sum up Native American ethics. Now, as we kind of go through some of the series of these very influential environmental ethicists that influenced how we look at the environment today and environmental ethics, we're going to kind of go through again little blips in time with these individuals. And so John Muir is our next kind of blip in time. And again, remember that he kind of came about in this time where many of the European colonists, again, had very much had this view of North America as a land to be conquered and using and managing those resources for human use. So when John Muir came along in the kind of late 1800s and early 1900s, he was this very famous American naturalist. You've probably heard of him. And he became the leader of what was called the preservationist movement. And this preservationist movement was a movement that called for some public lands to be set aside as protected wilderness and not for the purpose of being managed for the use by humans. So this was a very new movement that at this time period in environmental ethics. And John Muir was ultimately responsible for establishing Yosemite National Park in 1890. And the reason is that he took this very influential president to Yosemite and stayed and showed him Yosemite. They camped there. And after that trip, this very influential president that we'll talk about next ended up developing our national park system. So again, John Muir is ultimately responsible for that establishment of Yosemite as a national park. And in 1892, he founded the Sierra Club. And the Sierra Club still exists today and is actually a political force that works on the behalf of the environment. And so many of you probably have heard of the Sierra Club at some point. Now, John Muir was also a very important naturalist, and he was a writer. And so if you're interested in that kind of thing, he wrote some wonderful books. And so you feel free to look him up. So again, as I said, he had a large influence on our 26th president. That's Theodore Roosevelt, or commonly called Teddy Roosevelt. Again, he was around for the kind of early 1900s. And he really promoted more of the conservationist view, although again, he had some influence from John Muir on that preservationist movement. But he really, again, initially was under that conservationist view that all public lands should be managed wisely and scientifically, but that it should be managed primarily to provide resources for people. So he did establish 36 national wildlife reserves, and he more than tripled the size of our national forest reserves. But again, much of that was set aside for the purpose of, again, eventually providing resources for people, for humans. And again, he also established that national park system and is very well known for that. Aldo Leopold is an American ecologist. He was a wildlife manager, a professor, a writer, and eventually he ended up becoming a conservationist. But he or preservationist, I'm sorry. But he was initially trained in that kind of movement, that conservationist movement, that view of maintaining these public lands for the purpose of human use. And so he worked for the Forest Service, and he was even actually a part of the predator eradication program that killed predators such as wolves and bears for the purpose of protecting cattle on these cattle ranches. And so he was actually responsible for killing many of these predators. And over time, though, his views started to shift, and he started to shift towards more of this kind of preservationist view, and it was partially because of his involvement in this predator eradication program. And so he actually started to realize that these predators actually played a very vital role in the environment. And this actually led to him developing what's called the land ethic. And that was that, very simply stated, that anything that we did that was good for the environment was good ethically. And anything that was bad for the environment that we did that was bad for the environment, that was ethically wrong. So he really developed this kind of land ethic point of view. Now, in 1949, Aldo Leopold is most famous for a book that he wrote called A Sand County Almanac. And the Sand County Almanac kind of laid the groundwork for this field of environmental ethics. And really, again, looking at wilderness and wildlife as having their own intrinsic value. This intrinsic value means that that things have, and wildlife, wilderness has its own value outside of just human use. And he argued that the role of humans should actually be to protect nature and not to conquer it. So again, Aldo Leopold in his own time frame had his kind of own evolution of his environmental ethics, from more of that conservationist ethical view to more of the preservationist ethical view. Garrett Hardin was another very influential person in the world of environmental ethics. Now, he had some kind of weird outside views on eugenics and things, so he's oftentimes not really talked about in terms of environmental history, but he did have this kind of important idea of open access resources. And so let me kind of go back and get into him. So he was an American ecologist, a microbiologist, and he developed what we called the tragedy of the commons. And that's based on this idea of the fact that there are open access resources. And these open access resources are resources that can be used by anyone. For example, these resources would be things like air, right? Air is an open access resource. We can breathe it. We can breathe as much as we want of it. We don't have to ask for permission to breathe that air. We don't have to pay for that air, right? It is an open access resource. You can also think of like deep oceanic communities are an open access resource as well. And this idea of the tragedy of commons came about by the fact that these open access resources, because they can be used by anyone, there is an incentive to abuse or overuse them. And when that happens, when they are abused and overused, that everyone pays for the problem, but only the overusers will benefit from that. And so an example, really interesting example of this is grazing. So for example, let's say that we have this grazing land and we have a certain number of people that have goats, that maybe it's, 4 or 5 individuals that have goats on this land and they're grazing this land, right? Now let's say that one of these individuals decides to add more goats because they want to make extra money. And then maybe a second individual also decides to add more goats because they want to make some more money. And eventually what happens is there's just too many goats on the land, and the grazing land, the grazing plants that are available run out. And so everyone pays in this case, right? Because the land's no longer able to be grazed. However, the only people that are really going to benefit from this were the overusers, because they're going to have more goats to sell off and profit from. So again, that's the idea of this tragedy of the commons. And Hardin also was responsible for developing what's called the first law of human ecology. And he said that we can never do merely one thing that any intrusion into nature has numerous effects, many of which are unpredictable. So he's also kind of responsible for this first law of human ecology. Another very important person in the history of environmental ethics is Rachel Carson. And many of you have probably heard of Rachel Carson. I teach marine biology as well, so she's someone we talk about in environmental biology or in marine biology as well. She came about and was most influential in the early to mid 1900s. She was a marine biologist again that worked for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And as she was doing research, especially on birds, she ended up discovering that one of the most common pesticides that was used at the time, DDT, was actually poisoning our birds. And she was so influential that she actually induced changes at the government level where, again, DDT was banned from being used. So she wrote a bestseller book called Silent Spring. If you have not read that book, I highly recommend it. It's a very good book. And she really inspired the environmental movement that started in the 1960s. Her book was that influential. So let's go ahead and talk about kind of how environmental ethics might involve your daily life. So again, you might not use environmental ethics on a day-to-day basis, but you probably have developed some opinions about environmental ethics, and especially about something called intrinsic value. So remember, this idea of intrinsic value is that things or animals can have their own value on their own without, again, the influence of humans. So I just want you to think about this question. Do other animals have intrinsic value? Other animals, meaning other animals besides humans, have intrinsic value. So I want you to go ahead and kind of answer this question in your mind. 1, yes, they should be considered equal to humans. 2, yes, but they are worth less than humans. And 3, no, they are only valuable if they benefit humans. So again, there is no right or wrong answer to this, but I'm guessing that most of you probably picked 1 or 2. Now, again, this is a very different answer than probably what you would have gotten, 50 years ago, 50, 60 years ago. The majority of the population would probably have picked 3. And so again, this is just an interesting question to see how environmental ethics has changed over time. Now, we talked about the fact that there's going to be these different approaches to environmental ethics, and there were these 3 main approaches to environmental ethics. So the first one is what we call an anthropocentric point of view or approach. And this is where human interests are considered to be most important, and all other species kind of possess this instrumental value, which means that they are only valuable if they're useful to humans, okay? So that instrumental value is kind of the opposite of intrinsic value, right? We're saying now that these other animals are only valuable if they provide some use to humans. And so that's that anthropocentric point of view. Now, the biocentric approach to environmental ethics says that all life does have intrinsic value and all living things do have a right to exist, but not all things have equal value. So there are some organisms or some things that have a more value than other. For example, you may say that animals have more value than plants, okay? And that would be a biocentric view, okay? And then the last point of view is, or last approach to environmental ethics, is an ecocentric approach. And that means that you consider all parts of the environment as having intrinsic value. That again, that all, not just the animals, but water, air, rocks, they all have this important role to play in the environment and this important intrinsic value. And so this also means that oftentimes there are ecologically important species that may have more value. So, and this will come into play when we talk about things like keystone species, species that have a very important role or niche in their communities, so much so that if you remove them, the entire community and ecosystem changes. So we'll talk about some of those examples kind of later on in the semester. But those are the three main approaches to environmental ethics. We can also talk about the different levels of responsibility. So, for example, who or what is responsible for the environment and the environmental problem? We could be at the individual level, where each individual person has a responsibility. And a great example for this is recycling. So, for example, if you have a water bottle, your individual responsibility is to put that water a bottle in your recycling bin, right? Now, you can also be at the level of corporate responsibility, where a company may have a responsibility or role to play in that recycling program. So maybe they have, a recycling program and posters and bins and maybe an incentive program, right? And then you can have the societal responsibility. So where governments and activist groups are being responsible for that environmental problem. So again, in our recycling example, this would be maybe you might have a local government that provides recycling bins. And they actually provide recycling pickup, right? So that would be where you would be at the level of a societal responsibility. And then global responsibility is where multiple countries are working together. And so in our recycling example here, oftentimes many countries will ship off some of their recycling. There was quite a bit of our recycling that used to be shipped off to China. And then that puts a lot of strain on a single country. That country may become overwhelmed and can't handle all of that recycling. And then that recycling can end up becoming trash and ending up in waterways. And so then multiple countries may get together and say, okay, well, we need to fix this problem. How can we globally distribute recycling so that it's not just the responsibility of a couple countries. So that would be an example of global responsibility. Now, sometimes when we talk about, corporate responsibility, some of the challenges with corporate responsibilities are companies can mislead people. And this is something that we call greenwashing. And that's when companies will use marketing to appear more environmentally friendly than they actually are. And the big kind of key giveaway for this is that if a company is spending more money on marketing a green image than they are on the actual environmental programs that they're supposed to be promoting, then that's a big hint that they're using greenwashing. So for example, this is a great example of greenwashing here. Companies advertising that this natural tobacco, is better, it's additive free, and it makes you think that it's probably environmentally better for your health as well. And obviously this isn't the case. Natural tobacco is just as bad for your health and the environment as any other tobacco product. So that's a great example of greenwashing. And then, so I wanted to give you a couple, we're going to kind of go back to talking about those different approaches to environmental ethics. And I want to give you an example of this. And so this is actually a local example of a local environmental problem. Some of you may have heard of the Salt River wild horses. And there's quite a few wild horses along the Salt River, literally hundreds of them, and they live along the Salt River. They were introduced long ago by Europeans in the 1800s, and they are not native to the area. They do cause some problems. They cause, just like cattle grazing, they can cause erosion, especially bank erosion to the river, pollution from feces, amongst other things. And so there was a plan, an environmental plan, to round up and auction some of these horses, proposed in 2015. Now, there ended up being a large petition to stop this because the majority of these horses that would be rounded up and auctioned would end up in slaughterhouses. And so about 300,000 people signed a petition to stop the roundup, and they actually did stop that roundup. So I have a couple of questions to see if you kind of understand the different, again, ethical approaches here. So for those individuals that were supporting the roundup of the horses to protect the environment, would be an example of which approach? Anthropocentric ethics, biocentric ethics, or ecocentric ethics? So again, the key here is that they're supporting the roundup of these horses to protect the environment as a whole. So the ecology of that environment as a whole. And so if you answered ecocentric, you were correct. And this is where we talked about, again, that ecological approach of protecting, again, the environment, and sometimes that approach, protecting the ecology of a whole, may include, again, giving more value to some animals over others. Okay. Now, again, we're not talking about whether or not that was right or wrong. It's just that that is the ethical approach to this, that ecocentric, if you supported that roundup, you would have more of an ecocentric ethical approach to this particular problem. Okay. Now, if you were in opposition to the horse roundup, and again, the slaughtering of these horses, because again, you believe that they have, as a living being, some intrinsic value, then this would be an example of which approach? Again, anthropocentric ethics, biocentric ethics, or ecocentric ethics. And in this case, if you said biocentric ethics, you would be correct. And that would be because you believe that these horses' lives have value, intrinsic value, and they should be respected. And so the main point of giving you this example and showing you this example is that these environmental ethical questions that we have to deal with don't always have these easy answers. When we talk about right or wrong, right, it goes back to that kind of challenge of which approach do you take? Who is making the decision on what's right or wrong? And what approach are they using to their ethics to come up with that answer? So really kind of an interesting environmental problem. And you can see that there's oftentimes conflict between these different ethical approaches to an environmental problem. And this week's lab is actually going to explore these different approaches and will kind of help you to understand them better. So, we talked a lot about the environmental movement of the 1960s, especially that it was really spearheaded by Rachel Carson and the book Silent Spring. And again, that kind of started in the 1960s, but that environmental movement has often ignored issues of race and class. And so around the 1980s, the environmental justice movement started. And this started initially because they looked at, there was a toxic landfill that was to be put in North Carolina. And it was to be put in an area that was primarily inhabited by African Americans and more kind of low income African Americans. And so people kind of came together and said, look, this is wrong. We shouldn't be putting these toxic landfills in these areas where people of low income and different races are, inhabiting these areas. And so we really started to look at not just the environmental movement, but that environmental justice movement, really kind of focusing again on the race and class issues associated with that. Another great example is, again, an oil pipeline that was supposed to be put in through some Native American land. You guys are probably familiar with this. And obviously, that oil pipeline is going to, be destructive to the surrounding environment, and that surrounding environment was used by Native Americans. So again, this would be an environmental justice issue in that it is impacting, it has a much greater impact on a particular race. So again, some other another kind of interesting example to this is I was just actually down in Mexico teaching a course in Puerto Penasco. It was a study abroad course, and there is an issue with the vaquita porpoise down there. And the vaquita porpoise is highly endangered. There are only about 10 of them left in the wild, and unfortunately they're really endemic to the upper northern Gulf of California. And because of that, their populations are in trouble due to overfishing. And so the challenge is that they use gill nets to fish the totoba, which is a very large fish. It's a very profitable fish. And unfortunately, that fish has been overfished, and those gill nets not only trap the totoba, but they've trapped many vaquita over the years. And so much so that, again, they've been extremely detrimental to the vaquita population. Now, the challenge is that as you put bans in place and set up reserves, the challenge is that this is going to impact your local fishermen along with the commercial fisheries. And unfortunately, the local fishermen were the ones that were likely to be fishing more sustainably, much more sustainably than the commercial fisheries. So again, sometimes when we look at environmental justice and we look at things like what has had the greatest impact on the totoba population, and the vaquita population in Mexico, it's not really those local fishermen, but those big commercial fisheries and some of the illegal fisheries that are out there. There's actually some Asian fisheries out there that are harvesting the totoba just for their swim bladders because it has medicinal purposes. So again, that's just kind of an example of how we need to look at environmental justice and how it impacts again, not just race, but also class, these, fishermen that are local, and again, using fishing as a means for survival. This idea of environmental justice really kind of came about with a report that came out by the United Church of Christ in 1987. And this report came out and it looked at where hazardous waste and pollution was placed. And they found that the majority of hazardous waste and pollution was actually being placed near communities of color. And they called this environmental, they gave it a term, they called it environmental racism. And about 20 years later, a new report came out in 2007, and they found that not much had changed, that neighborhoods with toxic sites have twice as many people of color as neighborhoods without toxic sites. They also found that areas with clustered sites, meaning they have multiple toxic sites in one area, are likely to have about 69% people of color. So again, that kind of going along with that, kind of showing that distribution is supporting that environmental racism. And really, there was no change from 1990 to 2000. So this really relates back to this idea of the UN Sustainable Environmental Goals, where we're looking. Our goal is again to reduce inequalities and provide that peace, justice, and strong institutions for all. And so when we look at that environmental justice again, that environmental justice is supporting these UN goals. Now, a lot of this goes back to an initial policy that you're probably familiar with called redlining. And what happened was initially banks that were providing mortgages in areas like Seattle here would draw a red line around areas that are more desirable for home loans. And minorities were and still are discouraged from buying homes in the desirable areas. So for example, the red here area is marked as undesirable. The yellow here and then here is kind of somewhat desirable. The blue areas are like, pretty good areas. And then the green are these like highly desirable areas. And so again, minorities were initially really discouraged from buying areas in these or buying homes in these blue and green areas. And what they found is that these undesirable areas here in red, you can see, are surrounding these industrial areas where pollution is much higher. So again, a lot of this kind of environmental injustice was kind of initiated with this process of redlining. Okay, so we're going to kind of take a little aside there, and we're going to go in and focus on an area where environmental ethics impacts you more on a daily basis. So I'm going to ask this question: what do you eat? Would you eat a dog? And why or why not? Oops, I'm sorry. And then my second question for you is, do you eat cows, pigs, or chickens? And why or why not? Again, there's not a right or wrong answer here. I just want you to kind of think about this. So if we're going to apply this process of utilitarian ethics to our questions in just a minute. But I need to take a minute and explain what utilitarian ethics is. And it's easiest just to leave animals behind for a second and talk about utilitarian ethics in this idea of pulling a lever. So you've got a trolley or train on a track system, and you here are the person that is in charge of the lever. And if you pull the lever and keep the trolley on its same track, or you don't pull the lever and keep the trolley on its same track, it's likely to kill many more people than if you do pull the lever, switch tracks, and it will only kill one individual. So utilitarians say we should do the greatest good for the greatest number. And most people would likely pull the lever and go ahead and choose to just kind of do the greatest good for the greatest number. And that would be to take this person's life to save all of these ones. So when you do these utilitarian ethics, you have to consider other people's interests when we make these decisions. Now, if we apply utilitarian ethics to animals instead of just people, then we can consider what's called the animal welfare movement. And this was kind of initiated by a person by the name of Peter Singer in 1975, and he wrote this book called Animal Liberation. And he applied this utilitarian ethical view to animals. And he said that we should include animals in our calculation of the greatest good. Instead of just including humans, we should also include animals. And so why are animals included? Why should we include animals? And Singer said it all comes down to suffering. Singer says that any organism that's capable of suffering should not be caused to suffer unnecessarily. And so when we talk about suffering, we have to ask ourselves this question: can they feel pain? Do they have emotions? And do they care how they're treated? So let's talk about these questions. So let's look at these three animals. When you look at a cat and you ask the question, does a cat feel pain? Majority of you will say yes, a cat can feel pain. Does a dog have emotions? Again, any of you that have been around a dog will say yes, dogs have emotions. Does a cow care how it's treated? Now, many of us are not around cows on a day-to-day basis, and so this is a harder question to answer. But if you consider a cow, and if you looked at a cow and someone were to try to beat that cow and hit that cow, and that cow had an opportunity to move away, it would. And so that shows us that a cow does care how it's treated. And by Singer's view of applying this utilitarianism to animals, he said we should not cause animals to suffer unless, oops, sorry about that. We should not cause animals to suffer unless it's necessary. So again, just kind of some food for thought in terms of looking at applying these principles to the animal world. Now, we can look at this kind of idea of animals and using animals, right, in terms of how we use land animals and how many of them are actually used for food in the US each year. And so this does not include fish. This is just land animals, primarily, again, poultry, cows, and pigs. And so when we look at this, just take a guess as to how many land animals are used for food in the US each year. If you said 5 million, you were wrong. If you said 500 million, you were also wrong. If you said 1 billion, you were also wrong, because the answer is actually 10 billion. And so 10 billion land animals are used per year just in the US for food. And so here is your question. Is it necessary for us to kill 10 billion animals a year for food in the US? So do you think it's necessary to kill 10 billion animals a year for food? And again, remember that there's not a right or wrong answer to this. I just want you to think about this in terms of environmental ethics and some of the different approaches that we've talked about. Do you think it's right? And if not, can it be changed? And with this last question, I want you to think about, if it can be changed, how? What kind of changes would you make? So really kind of interesting to think about some of these questions, and we're going to talk more about this as we go through the semester. So again, I want you to keep these questions in mind. So this is the end of my environmental ethics lecture, a little longer than I wanted, but you a good overview of environmental ethics and kind of a different way of approaching and thinking about things. All right, if you have any questions, please let me know. And don't forget to do that environmental ethical assignment with the questions as well as the lab for this week.